Join me in this episode. We're going to explore the latest journal released by Games Workshop, which allows us to play games of Zone Mortalis in Heresy 3.0. We're going to explore the history of Zone Mortalis and how it evolved into the much loved game it is today. The new rules, the reserved stratagems, and building armies for Space Marines and Mechanicum in the bitter confines of Zone Mortalis. Now, it's fair to say Horus Heresy players get very excited about the battlefield environment. Fully painted armies on awesome looking terrain is about as much an evolving diorama as it is a wargame. If you've heard about Zone Mortalis but you're unsure what it is, buckle up because here's a breakdown. The Divisio Militaris applied the category of Zone Mortalis to some of the deadliest battle zones encountered by the Imperium during the Great Crusade, and later during the assault of the War Master's forces upon the Imperium itself during the Horus Heresy. These areas were characterised not by the presence of an especially dangerous enemy force, but instead they were defined by the environment itself. Amongst a number of critical attributes, the key characteristic of these regions is what housed them. For each battle to be given this designation, they took place within a structure, beyond the support of tanks or the reach of artillery fire, and often inaccessible to large war machines. Be it within the dense hive cities found across the breadth of the Imperium, or the labyrinthian tunnels of Xenos layers. To fight a war in Zone Mortalis was to fight in the confines of corridors or tunnels, never to be sure of what lurked around the next blind corner or armoured blast door. In place of fighting from grid sector to grid sector, or even building to building across the width of a Civitas block or open ground, warriors within the Zone Mortalis would exchange fire from room to room at point blank range. They would hear the enemy as they advanced, their footsteps pounding on deck plate floors and the thunder of the gunfire echoing through the ducts and crawl spaces. Only at the last moment would they see their foe, illuminated not by the light of day, but the dim glow of failing lum strips as they came from within the darkness, with their blades bared and their guns already blazing. This is quite possibly one of the most succinct descriptions or depictions of Zone Mortalis I've ever read. Wow. Is Zone Mortalis new? Well, no, it's not. Further to digging into the history of its origins, Zone Mortalis rules were originally published as boarding action with Imperial Armour, Volume 9, The Badab War, Part 1 in 2010. Zone Mortalis as we now know it, however, was later published within the Horus Heresy Book 1, Betrayal, in 2012, so that it could be played using 6th edition Warhammer 40,000 rules, and again in Book 3, Extermination, in 2014. So starting with Badab, this discusses boarding action, and the opening paragraph clearly sets out what to expect. It states the following rules present the chance to fight out some of the most savage and desperate ship-to-ship boarding actions that played a key part in the struggles of the Badab War. Boarding actions between star vessels are truly deadly affairs, vicious and swift, close-quarter duels in the most treacherous and dangerous environments imaginable. In short, the kind of conflict which Space Marines excel. The designer's note is also resoundingly clear. These boarding assault rules are intended to offer a new and exciting variation of playing games of Warhammer 40,000. They are also unashamedly designed to be fatal and chaotic affairs, as fighting on a burning star vessel in the middle of a space battle ought to be. It's the kind of game where all sorts of situations are going to be thrown up from time to time and sudden reversals will occur, so have fun with it. Hyper-competitive players will be better served elsewhere. What a bold statement, and I couldn't agree more. Insert shenanigans here. Now, I don't own the Badab books, more's the pity. However, a friend very kindly let me flick through their copy when I was researching this video. This is the first time I was able to have a proper look at the book, and I now wholly understand why it's so sought after. It is an incredible resource. Now, for boarding action, we have 16 whole pages setting out a new way of essentially fighting battles in what is possibly one of the most thematic settings. Boarding action introduces several new rules and pieces of war gear which have shaped Zone Mortalis to what we know it as today. For example, the concept of hazardous terrain. This was real, whereby models moving more than 6 inches would be required to take a dangerous terrain test. Cold in the void or cold void. This would result in rending shooting attacks, as well as void-hardened armour, such as what we now find on breaches. we have what is a basic catastrophic damage table, a 2d6 table ranging from hull quake, wildfire, and structural collapse. Wildfire is a personal favourite of mine, where massive fireballs consume sections of the battle plate, and structural collapse is hilarious, whereby parts of the ship essentially fall apart. Amazing. Now, this table does actually get revisited in future publications, often reflecting modern rules writing. However, the Project Nexus crew over in Denmark updated the table in 2nd edition, and they did an absolutely incredible job. And I later updated it for events in 3rd edition. The catastrophic damage table is so much fun, throwing in a wide variety of environmental effects that can significantly alter the course of the game. It is just so much fun. Interestingly, when it came to setting up for games of Zone Mortalis, in the Badab books we find an image titled The Sample Deck Level, which illustrates a Space Hulk-esque style corridor arrangement, linear corridors and larger square and rectangular rooms, lending itself to a more labyrinthian, almost organic layout, where the structure of the battlefield has been built over centuries versus the endless uniform layouts on seemingly a colossal scale. And I do look forward to trying out these different layouts in the future. Badab also introduces a variety of general stratagems as well as stratagems for defenders and attackers. General stratagems include tunnel access and flanking assaults, which would translate as infiltrate, deep strike and outflank in kind of modern language. You could also opt to equip a squad member with a las cutter, as well as placing sentry guns. Clearly someone's been watching Alien. Defensive stratagems were quite straightforward, with strong point terrain, barricades, but also traps. So for example, on a 4+, the trap goes bang. Large blast, strength 4, AP 5, add a status for 3.0 and we'd be golden. They also used to have crew gangs, which were poorly trained and poorly equipped crew armed with shotguns, las pistols and close combat weapons, pressed into combat in an emergency. Described as far from the best trained soldiers, but well motivated, as nothing but death or slavery awaits them should they be taken. And it's interesting to note that the crew gangs were actually reintroduced in Black Book number 3. For the attackers, they introduced the interdiction assault stratagem, which might sound familiar, either through the use of advanced phase generators to render the surrounding terrain out of sync with reality, or the rather more brute force approach of blasting out intervening ferrocrete or earth with seismic charges. The attackers make a major breach in either the ceiling, floor or walls, from which they have troops poised to make a storm assault, which is a nice little Easter egg. We've also got fire wasps, which are narratively one of my favourite models in the Heresy and is something that we should all have a go at kit bashing at least once. These are small Mechanicum combat reconnaissance drones intended to clear the way for advancing parties, armed with a searchlight and a flamer. A certain someone might have introduced these at recent events, that is me, throwing out random flamer templates and defensive roll, with Panic 1 causing, you guessed it, absolute shenanigans. They are, again, so much fun. And one I hadn't seen before, despite also being in Book 3, is Devastation drones, armed with a demolition bomb designed to inflict maximum damage. Essentially an infantry model on a 20mm base, the Devastation drone may be detonated at any point in one of the owning player's shooting phases. Place a 5-inch blast template over the centre of the drone. Everything caught by the blast suffers a strength 8 AP3 hit, and the Devastator drone, along with any removable terrain models, including bulkhead doors, are removed from play. I wonder why this doesn't feature in more modern publications. However, we are definitely going to be introducing these in future scenarios. Moving on to Book 1, Betrayer. When discussing terrain, this goes on to stipulate that Zone Mortalis has been designed to work with Forge World Zone Mortalis tiles. However, any suitably tangled and confined battlefields, such as can be formed using the illustrated tile board from Games Workshop's Space Hulk game, closely packed Necromunda scenery, and any endless variety of terrain of your own devising can be used in conjunction with this rules expansion. So, we have it written in the founding of the Heresy books that every Necromunda model is in fact a Heresy model. What really strikes me is they've once again built on the narrative for Zone Mortalis. They've introduced new rules such as Firestorm and Shrapnel, where template weapons gain +1 strength. Combat victors being able to reroll sweeping advances, because if you break from combat, there is quite literally nowhere to hide, as well as blind panic and using blip deployment. We even get more Zone Mortalis in Book 3 Extermination, coined Blood in the Void expansion, which introduces warlord traits, 4 more missions with an emphasis on hit and run campaigns, and it also introduced a stratagem called Murder Servitor Autoclade. But what does this mean? The warship is equipped with chambers within which are sealed small numbers of skull-faced murder servitors, their hands replaced with grafted-on billhooks, spikes, axes, and other equally crude but effective weapons. At the captain's command, every chamber is unsealed and the murder servitors are activated, tearing forth in a savage tide to scour the ship of borders. These come in units of 3, and whilst they're only toughness 3 and 1 wound, they are weapon skill 5 and strength 5 with 3 rending attacks. Just saying, these could be made using the Mechanicum Silax models. It also introduced a legendary battle, now often referred to as exemplary battle missions, the taking of the Contrador, whereby the Imperial Fist Alexis Pollux faces Erasmus Golg and the Iron Warriors in the Battle of Phal. This is one of the most iconic battles set in the Heresy, and if you'd like to see it on the channel, let me know in the comments below. It's fair to say Zone Mortalis is well established within the Heresy community, and since the latest journal was announced, there's been significantly more chatter across the Heresy community as a whole. Now, where does my interest lay? Well, I've been a fan of Zone Mortalis since the Black Books. However, owing to accessibility to suitable amounts of terrain, I always struggle to get games that could adequately reflect the deep, cramped confines we always read about. However, fast forward to today, and we've now got a consistent access to plastic terrain, and the format of the game has changed from larger points on a 6x4 table, which, let's be fair, is epic, to 1500 points on a 4x3. Interesting to note that in the playtest PDF that was released last year, it stated that players should use a 4x4 table and like 1500 points. It's a comparatively mute point. It would be interesting to understand how a 4x3 table was reached. As a business, it's unusual to encourage customers to buy less, in this case terrain. However, I do think it might be down to barriers to entry. Purchasing, building, painting 16 tiles of Zone Mortalis terrain is a commitment, and I know. I've painted my fair share. It also might be down to playtesting. We've played dozens of Zone Mortalis games and found that tables, even a 3x3, provide sufficient space for a brutal game of Zone Mortalis. We just use a 6-inch or an 8-inch deployment zone, depending on the deployment map. Another point to note is the new deployment maps typically have a 12-inch deployment, which generates a few theories. By having larger deployment zones, this means players can get into the action quicker, smashing through the 5 or 6 turns comparatively quickly. But there's also the confined space rules, which does allow the introduction of tanks in some situations, which in turn, does require larger deployment zones. There are some instances, such as trying to capture an underground vehicle depot, which would lend itself to having tanks in games of Zone Mortalis. However, in my mind, tanks should just be used as terrain. Or players might be able to interact with the tanks to try and activate the turrets and the weapon systems, rather than have it as a designated active model. But that's me, and let's be fair, I can be outspoken at times. Coming full circle, I do think the deployment maps have been formatted so that players can use tanks. Otherwise, a 3x3 table with smaller deployment zones could work just as well if you were getting started. I've also noticed that within the promotional pictures, within the books and on Warcom, these illustrate layouts that are significantly more open than what we're used to. Us grognards, which I do say with endearing affection, will remember endless corridors that created a regimented yet organic battle. There was the tense build-up as players opened doors and rounded corners, often leading to 1 or 2 larger spaces to get that epic clash and final showdown. Zone Mortalis is just so good. Now let's look at the new journal. As previously released journals, this journal comes in at 48 pages. However, with the exception of the opening page, there's no new fluff per se. It's essentially a whole new rulebook for playing games of Zone Mortalis in 3rd edition, as well as introducing 5 brand new units, which are compatible with both Zone Mortalis and Frontline games. Flicking through the journal, it's nice to see that the matter of the ceiling is clarified and that walls do in fact block line of sight and cannot be moved through or over. One of the biggest game dynamics is hidden under corridors and chambers, however. It's the infamous hazardous checks. This is an updated rule that means any unit that moves over 9 inches in any phase must make a hazard test, and a roll of a 1, that model is removed. And the only exception is during the assault phase when calculating setup and charge moves. Trust me when I say this, moving a multi-wound model such as your commander or a contemptor more than 9 inches is really nerve-wracking and makes you seriously consider your life choices. It's also incredibly funny when a unit is routed, falls back 10 inches and ends up rolling a load of 1s and takes a load more damage. It's just brilliant. Now this does seem a really brutal restriction. However, this is Zone Mortalis. We can't have jet bikes screaming through the corridors at 200 miles an hour without consequence. It is, however, a bit of a shame to see the clarification around tight squeezes is worded in a very dry style. It needed to be clarified that you can't shoot through closed doors or even walls. Previous publications emphasised Zone Mortalis is not to be taken too seriously, perhaps during a time where writers had more creative freedom to berate those without common sense. Is this the world we live in today? Sadly, seemingly so. Moving on. Now, for anyone who saw our first 3rd edition Zone Mortalis battle report with Andy and Matty, doors in a locked state proved very troublesome. Relying on intelligence tests was very frustrating, which took troops a very long time to get across the tabletop. Thankfully, breacher charges have been ported over from the PDF and are aimed to be used on fortification, in this instance, doors. They hit automatically at initiative 0, strength 10 AP dash, but do damage D3 plus 3. Now, doors are actually quite complicated little sausages when you read about them in the rules. They're armour 12 with 3 hull points and are treated as fortifications. However, doors are considered to be vehicles for the purposes of combat, but for damage purposes they treat all glances as 1 point of damage. For those with simpler minds, such as myself, breacher charges hit automatically and a 2+, the door is destroyed. Bosh. Why it's so complicated? The only material difference would be if you chose to attack with grenades or a close combat weapon or a melter bomb. It's a little bit janky to get your head around, but it does get the job done. Moving on to special rules, barrage weapons may only fire directly. No flyers, because there's a ceiling, and the scattering distance of blast is always limited by walls and doors. Some lovely common sense. Blind Panic has been tweaked from previous iterations, whereby a model or a unit falling back which passes a friendly unit subject to a status must immediately take a leadership test. Now, I love this dynamic. It reminds me of playing goblins in Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and we've seen this actually happen on the tabletop. Given how prolific statuses are in this edition, the potential for whole flanks falling back are entirely plausible. Confined spaces has also been ported over from the playtesting rules, which limits areas of the battle grid depending on the number of wounds or hull points a model or unit has. For example, where an area of the battle grid denoted as confined space 4, only models that are bulky 4 or less, or a vehicle with 4 hull points or less can manoeuvre within these spaces. Part of me understands why this dynamic was needed. As set out earlier within the video, games of Zone Mortalis are depicted using significantly less terrain than in previous editions. Therefore, with larger open spaces, using the confined space rule to limit certain size models does make sense. And I've seen it be explained quite well online, where you could just colour code the board, which in turn denotes whether it's subject to the confined space rule and the value. However, if you have plenty of terrain with suitably sized doors on the tabletop, this rule kind of becomes surplus to requirement. And I'll say it again, unless you're playing in a vehicle depot or you're integrating between a game of Frontline and Zone Mortalis, which is absolutely doable, tanks can stay at home. There, I said it. Now, remember when I said doors are a bit weird? They're a bit hard to get your head around. Well, one of the special rules states doorways can slow the movement of models with bulky. And then there's a lot of text around doorway area terrain. However, I've not been able to find a visual reference of what doorway area terrain actually is. Is it the physical door frame? Is it within 1 inch of the door? Was it within 3 inches of the door? Remember when this used to be an unserious way of playing Heresy? I was losing the will to live writing this script by this point. So it states, if a unit starts a move outside any area of doorway terrain, but includes any models with the bulky X special rule that could potentially enter an area of doorway terrain, the player must declare if they want their unit to cross through any area of doorway terrain as part of their move. If the controlling player chooses not to cross any area of doorway terrain, the unit moves as normal, but no models in the unit may cross any area of doorway terrain. If the controlling player chooses for any model with the bulky X special rule in the unit to cross any area of doorway terrain, then the model with the bulky X special rule's movement characteristic is reduced by the amount which is the variant of bulky X special rule exceeds the variant of the doorway special rule for the duration of that movement phase. That just literally gave me a brain aneurysm trying to read that. That's literally taken straight from the book. Whew. I think if we're going to have to be this pedantic, I think we need to have a chart and a picture depicting what an area of doorway terrain actually is. You know, someone who's played a lot of Zone Mortalis in this edition and who likes to keep things simple. We've been saying that small doors can be accessed by models with a 40mm base or less. Large doors, do what you want. Bosh. Continuing with doors, a massive groan I hear on the horizon. They can either be in an open or closed state, which, guess what, makes sense. If you start or end your move within 2 inches of a door, you can attempt to change its state by passing an intelligence test. Note there is only one attempt per door per turn. However, if you fail, remember you can still attempt to shoot it and charge it. So the crush rule is a really cool concept. Again, it's really hard to get your head around, but simply the door closes, Marines underneath it get crushed, and any models not in coherency take strength 8, AP dash, damage 2 hits. Okay, bosh, right, okay. So in principle, this sounds great, and I look forward to changing the state of a door at a pivotal moment of the game. But if you're not playing a friend, this could lead to quite a lot of contention, which we Heresy players generally don't enjoy. We don't know what an area of doorway terrain is, and working out what coherency could prove to be controversial. For example, we might end up in an awkward conversation where someone's super expensive Death Star Praetor leading from the front is definitely the main part of the unit. It definitely isn't the model in the unit that is out of coherency and doesn't have to take that strength 8 AP2 hit. However, once the crush rule has been enacted, the door is stated as being open terrain for the remainder of the game. So there's no hungry hippo shenanigans. As I said, doors seem to be really weird. The fact that I've spent so long talking about it is a concern, and a lot of it could be covered off by using a chart for movement modifiers and a top-down drawing to explain visually what doorway area terrain actually is. Something that has been removed from 2nd edition is reinforcement points. However, we do now have reserve stratagems. Ironically, I was never a huge fan of reinforcement points in 2nd edition, so I'm quite interested to see how these reserve stratagems work in practice. Simply, you can place units in reserve at the start of the game, and the normal rules for reserves apply. However, during the reserve subphase, you can attempt to apply reserve stratagem to the unit. If you successfully roll the target number, you can then apply the stratagem. We've got reinforcements, forced march, encirclement, flanking force, mass elevator, and teleport strike. Now, outflank and deep strike don't actually apply in games of Zone Mortalis in 3rd edition. However, if the unit has one or both of these rules, they do get modifiers when attempting to use certain stratagems. So let's break it down in turn. Reinforcement stratagem can be applied on a 3+. If successful, you may choose to leave the unit in reserve or deploy it along the player's battlefield edge. Forced march can be applied on a 2+. If the unit is heavy, apply -1 modifier. If successful, you may choose to leave the unit in reserve or deploy along the player's battlefield edge. The controlling player must then successfully pass a willpower check or the unit becomes pinned. So what's the difference between reinforcements and forced march? Basically, you're more likely to get the unit on the table using forced march, however, they might become pinned. It's a bit situational, and it's something I'd only really consider if I desperately needed a unit on the table or had a unit with Battlesmith nearby to remove that status. It's also interesting that they've used a willpower check rather than a cool check. Now, the next three stratagems effectively allow units in reserve to deploy in different parts of the battlefield. So they're going to start off with encirclement, which can be applied on a 4+. If the unit is heavy, we apply -1 modifier. If successful, the unit can be deployed on the opposing player's board edge, but it may not charge. Flanking force also applied on a 4+. However, if it's heavy, apply -1 modifier. If it has outflank, however, we add +1. If successful, the unit can be deployed from either flank. That's really cool. Now, mass elevator. This can be applied on a 3+. The unit may be deployed from a designated elevator platform. I do love the idea of deploying via mass elevator. It's similar to the historic tunnels rule, but more in line with modern day Zone Mortalis themes. Lastly, teleport strike. This may only be selected by infantry models with the deep strike rule that are in reserve, but may not be units of anti-grav, i.e. jump packs, and can be applied on a 3+. There are no modifiers, however, if you roll a 1 for the reserves test, the unit is counted as destroyed and no victory points are scored. However, if successful, the unit deep strikes as normal but cannot charge. Huge risk and reward and very thematic. Rolling a 1 and the unit deploys inside a wall or outside of the ship. I do hope to see lots of teleporting Death Stars, and this could be very thematic, but with a 1 in 6 chance of losing the unit entirely is brutal and would almost certainly change the outcome of the game. Interestingly, at this point, we've got a new prime advantage called teleport transponders, meaning all models in this prime slot gain deep strike. Now, first time readers will get pretty excited about this, but it's only the way of enabling a prime slot to benefit from the teleport strike stratagem, which in turn may only be selected by models with the infantry unit type and may not be selected by units with the anti-grav subtypes. So no deep striking contemptors, I'm afraid. We've also got two new advanced reactions, which are called Take Cover and Bypass Cognitator. Take Cover seems to be a modified version of the 2nd edition Displace reaction. Simply, if someone shoots at your unit, roll a dice and move each model in that unit up to the value, and then gain a 6-up Shroud save. However, unlike in games of Frontline, it seems the Shroud only applies to the triggering shooting attack and doesn't, for example, last the whole turn, such as Smokescreen. Bypass Cognitator applies to the models with Battlesmith. The trigger is a little bit janky, but simply put, if an enemy unit ends its movement more than 8 inches away from the model with Battlesmith, the reactive player may choose a number of doors up to the value of Battlesmith X, where it may attempt to change the state of a door by passing an intelligence test. Now this is really cool, and it makes Magos and Tech Priests really strong and adds some weight to taking Engine Seers, who would make a really thematic, cool addition to any Zone Mortalis force. For example, a Mechanicum player may have a Magos, which is Battlesmith 3. If the Mechanicum player isn't going to use any reactions that turn, it does make sense to try and open a number of doors and improve manoeuvrability across the battle grid, or equally, they could close a number of vital doors that have been opened at the end of the enemy movement phase, who may be lining up a key charge. It's brilliant. I suppose the workaround is to try and destroy the door in the shooting phase and then charge through it in the assault phase, which again is very thematic and in keeping with, Zone Mortalis. Moving on to the missions, the Zone Mortalis Clearance Protocol Mission Pack. Now we've got 6 brand new missions included within this journal, which offer a different tactical challenge during the battle itself, but also with a host of alternate considerations during the army selection process. These missions reward players with victory points for the elimination of enemy units, but also domination of the battlefield. Whilst this concept doesn't necessarily reinvent the wheel, it's reassuring for me to see this is the direction GW have taken for writing Zone Mortalis missions, as this is what we've been doing. Kill points, sector control, and in some cases, objectives. Multiple ways of scoring, these methods really lend itself to how most people enjoy and want to play games of Zone Mortalis, and reflects the narrative of trying to take control of an underground labyrinth or battle plate whilst destroying the enemy with complete abandon. The new missions are Sector Assault, No Quarter, Bloodied Ground, Siege Control, Nexus of Ruin, which is good fun, and Total Domination. As mentioned previously, games are 1500 points using a 4x3 table. It's also interesting to see we've got three newly named deployment maps, Primus, Secundus and Tertius, when in reality it's Dawn of War, Hammer of Anvil and Vanguard Strike. However, these needed to be renamed and updated given Zone Mortalis is played on a 4x3 table. I actually think this is quite clever by the writing team by just keeping things simple. It's low-hanging fruit. One observation is the deployment maps typically keep armies 36 inches away from one another, irrespective of the deployment map used. As these are typically only 5 or 6 turn games, in our experience of managing locked doors and fear of failing hazard checks, players may find it quite hard work to get into combat on a table with good levels of terrain. However, with the move towards more open Zone Mortalis tables, I suspect a 36-inch separation distance was necessary. We also need to be mindful of how important reserve stratagems now work. Being able to essentially deploy on all 4 table edges is really interesting. We've got a new primary objective called Blood for Blood, which states each player scores 1 victory point when the last model of an enemy unit is removed as a casualty outside of the challenge phase. However, the second paragraph is crucial. If the unit that destroyed the enemy unit has Vanguard X, you instead score that many victory points, meaning Vanguard is huge. No more messing around with units withdrawing from objectives. If you get slapped by a unit from Vanguard, they be scoring. We've also got Sector Domination, which basically means the tabletop is separated into sectors, and if you have more units in the sector, you score that sector. Units with the status obviously don't count, and if the unit has line, they add the value of line to the overall score. However, the sector domination value is unchanged, meaning line units won't run away with the scoreboard, and I really like that. It's interesting to read that a unit doesn't have to be wholly within a sector to control it. However, the controlling player must state which sector they wish to score if they overlap multiple sectors. In my mind, I do think this needs to be cut and dry, and the unit must be wholly within the sector to score it. Otherwise, you might end up in really janky situations where players intentionally straddle several parts of the tabletop. I guess time will tell on that one. In addition, we've got a secondary objective called Slayer of Champions. If you win a challenge, you score the value of X. If the unit is Paragon unit, you get an additional 1 victory point. I like the idea that folks are being encouraged to partake in challenges. These are a lot of fun, but only scoring 1 victory point for essentially killing the enemy warlord in the most thematic way possible is a little bit underwhelming. And the fact you would only get 2 victory points for killing a Paragon model, as in a Primarch, is hardly a reward. Again, we'll give this a fair go. However, we've been rewarding players for winning challenges, but we've been giving additional victory points for slaying command and high command models in a challenge. I do think this is a missed opportunity, and I'll share the wording of the rule that we use in the comments below. Another observation when you're looking at Slayer of Champions is that in clearance protocol missions, these are to use 1500 points. Further to a cursory glance, I couldn't see whether there are any Paragon units that are valued at 375% or 25% or less. Perhaps this wording is a hangover from earlier iterations, or if people do decide to play larger games. In addition to the new objectives, we've got some new special rules, which I'm really excited to try. Abysmal Darkness reduces line of sight to 6 inches. That is crazy. Breach to action, D3 doors may change state and remain so for the remainder of the battle, which is quite cool. And Cognitator Terminal. This seems to come straight out of Fallout. I played the original PC games to death as a youngling, and the way these work seem very familiar. Essentially trying to hack the system, and I absolutely love it. In practice, a model in base to base may attempt to manipulate the terminal, which sounds a bit dodgy, making an interface test. Roll 2d6, subtract the model's intelligence and refer to the chart. If you roll low, you risk being attacked by the terminal, which is brilliant. Whereas if you pass, you can change the state of 3 doors and plunge 3 sections of the battlefield into abysmal darkness, essentially turning the lights off. Brilliant. Now, I did actually struggle a little bit getting my head around how this actually works in practice. So for my own benefit, I've simplified it. So let's say, for example, you want to use a Space Marine to try and take an interface test. You roll a 2d6 and you roll a 7. You subtract the model's intelligence value, which is 7, and the result is 0. It's useful little examples like this would make all of the difference in these journals. And to be fair, there is space within the book that they could include like these little bits of extra information. There's also advanced battle rules included, the first being campaign and ruined battlefield effects. Simply, if you choose to play all 6 clearance protocol missions, as would be expected through the ebb and flow of endless destruction, parts of the battle grid would be damaged beyond recognition. As such, players may choose to introduce confines, spaces and/or abysmal darkness to battlefield sectors, which is a really cool prospect and would result in some really great kind of organic battlefields. The second is unknown enemies, whereby units are placed on the tabletop using numbered tokens, which is an established way of playing Zone Mortalis since the beginning, originating in, back in the Space Hulk days of 1989. I really can't wait to try this. I think it's going to be a really fun way and add to the suspense in terms of playing games of Zone Mortalis. As mentioned, we've got 6 new missions. However, I'm not going to go through them all. I will have a focus on Nexus of Ruin, which seems to be a very popular amongst those who've played it. Deploying using Deployment Primus or Dawn of War, there's 2 sectors in the centre of the table, Alpha and Beta, with 2 elevator platforms at either side. The mission uses Blood for Blood, as well as Sector Dominion X and Slayer of Champions 3. For Sector Dominion, Alpha and Beta are worth 5 victory points, and the remainder of the map is worth 3 victory points. Now, one of the reasons why this mission is fun is it uses the mass elevator stratagem, where you roll for reserves as normal, no modifiers, and on a 3+, the unit may deploy from the elevator as normal. However, any models left within the footprint of the elevator at the end of the player turn are destroyed, presumably because they get squashed. Absolute shenanigans. Troops arriving from all over the place. This is exactly how we want to play games of Zone Mortalis. We've got 3 new primary detachments for Zone Mortalis, which have been introduced as part of this journal, to be used instead of the Crusade primary detachment. However, we do have the option to add Apex, Auxiliary and Allied detachments should we wish to do so. Surprisingly, these new detachments are very flexible. They do actually make it quite easy to write lists. You're not having to constantly rob Peter to pay Paul, trying to shoehorn that remaining auxiliary slot because there's a good amount of variety of slots. And each detachment actually leans into a distinctive theme. Now let's break down each of the new primary detachments in turn, and I've included some example lists at the end. The first is Strike Force, which sounds a little bit like Space Force. So slots include a High Command, a Command, 2 Heavy Assault slots, one of which is a Prime, 4 Troops, one of which is a Prime. Now, in my mind, Zone Mortalis is filled with Terminators, Breachers and Despoilers, filling the corridors for that close combat face-to-face melee, and this detachment really leans into that theme. I suspect we'll see lots of Terminators, one of which will probably be a Master Sergeant, and perhaps a logistical benefit to open up a War Engine or Heavy Support Squad for longer range firepower. Now, I reached out to some of the guys and I said, using these new detachments, write me a 1500 point list. So the first list that we've had is from Andy, aka The Big Show, and he is running his Iron Warriors. So he has chosen to select a Warsmith as his High Command, a Legion Champion in Terminator armour as his Command. For Heavy Assault, he's got Tyrant Siege Terminators. He's using the Hammer of Olympia Apex detachment, where he's taking a Castopherium Dreadnought and 5 Tartarus Siege Terminators. And he's also got an auxiliary detachment, a veteran cadre, running Domitar Cohort and a veteran despoiler squad. I think this is going to be quite a formidable force. I think when you're playing sector control, we're going to be looking at line units, but I don't think they become as important. I think people are going to be heavily leaning into Vanguard, and I think this is one of those lists. And I think it's quite like the way that this list is themed. You've got Terminators, you've got the Domitars, which are going to look absolutely fantastic on the tabletop, backed up by some despoilers. I really like this, and I look forward to seeing him probably put this list together and paint it sometime next week, because he is a super quick painter. With respect to Mechanicum, it's important to emphasise that Thanax, Castellax, Tech Thralls, etc. are support choices. Therefore, when a mech player sees 4 troop slots, we get overjoyed at the thought and the prospect of running 4 30-point Tech Priests. Now, tongue-in-cheek, this does actually open up some options for Mechanicum players. So in the command slot, I would consider using a Magos. There's 2 heavy support squads. I would use 2 units of Ursarax, one of which with the Master Sergeant Prime, both of which have Vanguard. I then consider a Tech Priest with Battlesmith, purely for running Cognator bypass and then opening up a logistical benefit for a unit of Myrmidon Secutors, because they are Vanguard certified. They are absolutely fantastic. They're Vanguard 3, and they're very, very, very good. And then finally, we've got the auxiliary detachment, where I'm looking at taking a Tagmata cohort, for example, using Castellax, Thalax, or Tac Thralls. And to be fair, the choice would be really just depending on which way I'd want to theme the army. Next up, we've got the Bulwark detachment. So slots include a high command, a command, 2 war engines, one of which are a prime slot, 2 support slots, one of which are a prime slot, and 2 troops choices. This could actually be quite a scary force to face, consisting perhaps 2 contemptors, 2 heavy support squads or quad rapier carriages, with breaches or despoilers in support. I suspect if you find yourself playing on more open gaming tables and abysmal darkness isn't in effect, this is going to provide a lot of base firepower. However, I'm a little unsure what prime advantage you would put on a war engine, for example a Boxnaut or a Dreadnought, as neither are command or sergeants, so wouldn't be able to benefit from like Paragon or Master Sergeant, and probably only lend itself to a logistical benefit. But let me know what you think in the comments below. For mech, I'm least likely to use this one, even though it's the only detachment with natural support slots. However, in the spirit of the video, again, Command Magos, 2 Thanatars, which seems excessive and would be massively punished if confined spaces was in effect. 2 units of Castellax Infernus, which are Vanguard certified, and we'll come on to those in a bit more detail in a moment. A Tech Priest, again, for the reasons aforementioned. And then another Tagmata cohort for Castellax, Thalax, or Tech Thralls. I'm happy to be corrected, however, I don't think it's really a natural fit for Mechanicum, and I think as a Mechanicum player, I'm least likely to want or to opt to use this one. Now, another list that Power put forward for Bulwark is, or Bulwark, I can't say it, Bulwark, is a Magos in command, 2 Tech Priests, one of which opens a logistical benefit, 2 Moroclaws and Lightning Locks, you troll, 4 Castellax Infernus, 4 Castellax with Maulers, and then 3 Domitars, and again that comes in at 1500 points. Again, that does actually seem quite a tasty list, and again I think Power, I think we need to play test that one. Lastly, Linebreaker, hugely popular. High command, 2 heavy assaults, 2 troops, 2 elites, one of which is a prime slot. Now this is a spicy meatball. I suspect you're going to see a lot of these in the wild, with what appears to be the best spread of line units and units with Vanguard that benefit from a better weapon skill kind of straight out of the box, and being able to add Master Sergeant onto your already good elite unit, such as, for example, veteran despoilers. For this one, Mechanicum players, we're going to be all over this. Again, Command Magos. For heavy support, that's 2 units of Ursarax, again, Vanguard certified, a Soul Tech Priest in the troop slot, again, for reasons previously mentioned. We're then going to be looking at 2 units of Myrmidons for elites, one of them with a Master Sergeant advantage, both of which are Vanguard certified. With the remaining 200 or so points, I'd look to auxiliary detachments, maybe consider a war engine detachment with 2 blood slaughterers for 100 points, or even allying some Skitarii battle pilgrims, which can opt to take line or vanguard. The next list is from Pal, again, Mechanicum player, unsurprisingly, all over this detachment. He's gone for a Magos, a Domitar battle maniple, and a unit of Myrmidon Secutors. Mechanicum players, we are going to do this. We have to get out of our system because it's going to be really, really strong. But we're going to see a lot of Secutors going forward in Zone Mortalis. He's also gone for a logistical benefit to add a unit of Silax, a retinue. Silax, again, are going to be awesome in Zone Mortalis, especially when you start booning them with the Cyberthurgy. And for the auxiliary detachments, he's gone for 4 Castellax Infernus. These are the Flame Castellax, which are really, really good in Zone Mortalis. Again, Vanguard certified. And finally, a unit of Vorax, which again, I've personally not got a huge amount of experience with them. They're going to be coming out in plastic imminently. I really want to use them because they do suit the theme and the narrative of Zone Mortalis. And I'm really excited. This is a list that I'm really excited to see. I've also got 2 units. The cheeky little spicy burrito has also included 2 units of Skitarii as an allied detachment. That is going to be a really, really good, well-rounded list. Now, this one is perhaps going to cause some division and perhaps even some outrage. So this is from Ian. Ian's gone, what is the worst list I could possibly make using Alpha Legion and this detachment? So, in my opinion, this isn't something that you should aspire to. This is perhaps something that you should avoid because it's a pretty tasty list. So again, it's Alpha Legion, Praetor and Terminator armor for his high command. He's got 2 units of Leonin Terminators, 6-man each, and a 5-man unit of Tartarus Terminators as a heavy assault. He's then using Officer Cadre to open up an Apex detachment. So you've got the Legion Terminator and Terminator armor, and then 5 full Tartarus Terminators. That's just absolutely insane. Yeah, that's just a wild list. Just all of the Terminator army. To be fair, I actually want to see this, and I actually want to play that. You might not prove very popular, and it is a slow-moving force. I don't think there's any line in there that I can see off the top of my head. Oh no, Leonins have line. So, you know, they're actually got a good balance of line and vanguard. Again, I think that's going to be a very durable list. It's going to be able to take a lot of damage. And having seen Leonins play on the tabletop, Ian and I filmed about a report, and he absolutely tore me a new one with those Leonins. So I think they are actually a unit to look out for in Zone Mortalis going forward. So this is quite an interesting one. We've actually got a White Scars list to look at as well. So using Hibao Khan as a command choice, we've got 10 veteran despoilers, which are elites, 2 units of Inducti, 15 men as the troop slots, and then Eben Keshig as the heavy assault. And then opening up an auxiliary detachment to open a war engine, in this case, a Leviathan Dreadnought. I actually think this list would actually do really, really well in Zone Mortalis. It's got a good mix of units, lots of bodies, which would thematically look awesome. That white armour, fill in those kind of dark, dank, tight corridors, amazing. Backed up by Leviathan Dreadnought. Again, I think we saw 1, if not 2 Leviathan Dreadnoughts at our big Greetings from the Warp mega battle back in April. I do genuinely think Leviathans are going to thrive, and it's going to be great to see them kind of back on the tabletop. Despite being expensive, they are absolute units in Zone Mortalis. So Mac tried to have a go at using the 3 new detachments for demons, because he's going heavy into demons, and it's really cool seeing what he's doing, exploring with a completely different and comparatively unused army in 3rd edition. So he was unable to make a list that he was happy with using the new detachments in the limited time that he didn't have. So he's just used the Crusade primary detachment. He's gone for 2 command choices. He's gone for a Demon Hierarch and a Demon Harbinger. He's used a logistical benefit to open a heavy support, so he's going to be running 3 Demon Brutes. And he's going to take 3 units of lesser demons as troops. In terms of auxiliaries, he's going to be taking 3 Ruinstorm Demon Beasts and then a Ruinstorm Greater Demon Beast, and that came in at 1,500 points on the nose. Now, this is an army that I have very little knowledge or experience of. I've only ever seen maybe 1 or 2 of them actually in the wild. In my experience, they do very, very well in frontline, so it'd be really interesting to see how they kind of fare in games of Zone Mortalis. Another one for Linebreaker. Henrik has put forward one for his Imperial Fists. So for his High Command, he put Fafnir Ran, and then Command, he's put Alexis Pollux. Now, we ribbed him a little bit because, like, who do you think you are, thinking you're you're worthy to play so many named characters in a small game of Zone Mortalis? But we'll let that slide because it's Henrik, and we all love Henrik. He's gone for 2 elites, so he's gone for 2 units of veteran breachers. For troops, he's gone for more breachers, and then for his heavy assault, he's gone for 3 Saturnine Terminators. I actually think this would actually be quite cool. We're going to be seeing 4 units of breachers backed up by the Saturnine Terminators, and then you've got 2 kind of pivotal characters in the ranks getting stuck in. I do actually think that would actually look really, really cool. Again, loads of Vanguard on the breaches. Yeah, I think that would be actually quite an interesting little army. As shown, these 3 detachments offer a lot of flexibility. Therefore, unless you need to open up an Apex detachment, I anticipate we won't see too many high command choices in games of Zone Mortalis. Based on what you've seen, I'd be really interested to hear how you'd run the 3 new detachments and which you might think be best for the new clearance protocol missions. Lastly, let's look at the new units. For me personally, it's great to see units not just for Space Marines. We've got Castellax Infernus for Mechanicum, Velataris Raiders, and Auxilia Combat Technicians for Solar, as well as the much anticipated Veteran Despoilers and Veteran Breachers. Starting with the Castellax Infernus, these come in at 110 points for 2, taking into account they automatically come equipped with Power Blades, which are my preferred close combat weapon for these absolute murder bots, as well as 2 Flamers and a Purge Incinerator, a new weapon no less. Interestingly, they lost the option to take any bolt weaponry, but more importantly, they've lost the Firestorm special rule, which is actually quite crucial. Now, why? Firestorm allows the controlling player to choose whether the model charges after snap firing its weapon when it declares a charge, although it fires at full blitz skill anyway, as Castellax have implacable advance, but let's put that to one side. Now, in this instance, the Castellax Infernus only fires template weapons, therefore the snap fire element is inconsequential. However, losing the opportunity to decide not to charge is unique for Automata. Part of me likes it for Zone Mortalis, because it just the rampant rage that you're going to see these flaming murder bots screaming through the tabletop. However, it's something that I hope isn't replicated for Automata overall. I do suspect, however, this is balanced out because the Castellax Infernus is Vanguard 3. Yes, bosh, amazing. Players will absolutely want these up the table, getting into combat, supported by a Magos to boon their weapon skill using Cybertheurgy. The Purge Incinerator uses a flame template, 1 shot, strength 6, AP 4 and damage 1, with breaching 6 up and panic 1. This would be in addition to 2 Flamers, which are 1 shot, strength 4, AP 5 and damage 1 and panic 1. That's going to be a lot of hits and a lot of wounds, and it's likely going to cause a panic check and make things a lot easier in combat for these comparatively slow robots. When you factor in that Power Blades are also strength 6, AP 3, damage 1 with breaching and shred 5 up, these Castellax Infernus are going to do some work in the depths of Zone Mortalis, and I'm very excited to cobble some together. Moving on to the Velataris Raider section, these are an elite unit which are quite tasty. Weapon skill and ballistic skill 4 with 2 attacks, and come with a boarding shield for 5 up invulnerable, armed with breaching shotguns, frag and crack grenades, and are also Vanguard 3. A unit of 9 comes in at 85 points, however some eagle-eyed readers will have already noted you may choose an additional 1 for 7 points. I'm fairly certain this should read 11, but it did tickle me. Now, I'm not overly familiar with Solar, however factor in the breaching shotgun with a 10-inch range, 1 shot, strength 5, AP 5, damage 1, stun 0. 10 of these are going to cause some damage. And the ability to shield wall the boarding shields for +1 toughness means they're going to give basic tactical Marines a run for their money, particularly in combat. I do think the Storm Mauls are a little lackluster and kind of more akin to the mauls used by the police in Demolition Man. Striking at initiative 2, 2 attacks, which is quite nice, strength 5, AP 4. damage 1 and breaching 6 up. I do think the saving grace is the volume of attacks rather than the weapon itself, but the modelling opportunities are second to none. I couldn't help but note when building the unit it says to salvage existing Necromunda models. Once again, every Necromunda model is a Heresy model. We've also got a second Solar Auxiliary unit, the Auxilia Combat Technician Section, that's a mouthful, which is a 5-man squad armed with blast pistols and a combat decryptor for 35 points. Essentially, the war gear allows Solar to take advantage of the bypass coginator advanced reaction and is considered as having a base intelligence characteristic of 9, which is actually quite strong and another really cool modelling opportunity. I also think credit should be given where it's due to whichever playtester or rules writer that made a conscious note that this unit, or that Solar was lacking a battlesmith unit from the ranks, and introducing this unit to the game means that they can now essentially take advantage of one of the biggest advanced reactions. Now the main event, veteran despoilers and breachers, both of which benefit from, you guessed it, Vanguard 3. Now, despoilers coming in units of 5 at 95 points, armed with bolt pistols, chainswords, frag and crack, and an additional 5 despoilers may be added at 18 points each. Now, the elephant in the room, these are weapon skill 5, 2 wounds, and 3 attacks. Finally, we're seeing a close combat unit with decent amounts of attack that don't just have lightning claws. However, you can arm them with lightning claws for 10 points per model. Despite the fact that these are units of 5 to 10 dudes with 2 wounds, the 3+ armor save isn't really a problem in Zone Mortalis. However, it may become an issue in frontline gaming. However, there'll be nothing stopping you putting them in a Rhino or a Land Raider. But in games of Zone Mortalis, I do think these units are going to shine, and I do think we'll see units of up to 10 armed with just power claws. After all, that's a mighty 50 weapon skill 5 rending and breaching attacks, striking at initiative. That's just going to cause some absolute carnage. Moving on to veteran breachers, I do think these fit quite nicely between despoilers and tactical squads. A unit of 5 comes in at 125 points with an additional 5 models at 22 points each. Again, weapon skill 5, 2 wounds and 2 attacks with 3 up and a 5 invulnerable. It's worth highlighting, similar to the Velataris raiding section, these do benefit from shield wall and therefore are able to benefit from a +1 toughness. As we all know, it's a dice game, and owing to combat being relatively short on dice compared to previous editions, needing 4s to hit and then 5s to wound when shield wall is engaged can prove really, really difficult to shift. Veteran breachers also probably have the widest accessibility to weaponry and therefore the best adaptability for Zone Mortalis. For example, they can swap their bolter for a combi weapon, chainswords, chain axes and shotguns can be changed for free, or they can swap a bolt gun for a Volkite charger, power weapon, power fist, or a single lightning claw. For every 5, a model can also take a flamer, grav gun, las cutter and melter gun, and the sergeant could, should it choose to do so, take a disintegrator pistol and a thunderhammer, for example. In terms of direction, I suspect Imperial Fist players might opt to take combi bolters with shield walls. It costs 5 points for twice as many shots, and they'll be able to take advantage of their +1 to hit. However, I can see units of 10 with a mixture of combi Volkite and or combi grenade launchers being especially popular, supported by some power fists and power axes. A cheeky grav gun might also be worthwhile, hoping for that shock pinning on a 5+, slowing down the enemy's advance, an opportunity to put more rounds down. Now, in summary, this is easily the best journal that they've released to date, surpassing the Skitarii and Talon journals, which I was very, very fond of. It creates a brand new way of playing one of our favourite games, and if you look past the formalities, provides plenty of opportunities for shenanigans. I'd love to hear what you think of the journal, which detachments you're going to theme your Zone Mortalis armies around, how are you going to use the new units, and have you had chance to play any of the new scenarios? Let me know in the comments below. If you've enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, and if you haven't already done so, why not consider subscribing? I'll see you in the next one.